There's a record called Fylde Guitars, which was made in 1977 for Bill Leader's Leader trailer record, and on it I played on the dobro that Roger had made me at that point. I played an Irish air, the green fields of America, in fact. So I'll play you another one. When I first started going to folk clubs, what I was looking at, because I was so obsessed with guitars, were lots and lots of guitars made in Europe imitating American-made guitars. So people like Hofner and Hagstrom and Levin and various other companies making their best attempts at making Gibson J45s and the like, Martin D18s. And then at a certain point in the early 70s, the Japanese started to make guitars which were not impersonating Martins and Gibsons, but they started to make their own take on those guitars. So Yamaha guitars became very, very popular. The FG180 and the FG140 were good guitars, but I was obsessed with the idea that there were better guitars to be had if you could find the people to make them. In this country at that point, there were people like John Bailey and Chris Eccles Hall making small numbers of guitars. Ralph Bown in York making very small numbers of guitars. He was sort of in his fledgling stage at that point, but he became one of the best guitar makers I've ever come across. Stefan Sobel in the early 70s began to make instruments, and he began to make them because you could not get the instruments in which he was interested. And he was very much influenced by an old Martin archtop guitar and Portuguese guitars, which were very odd instruments, sort of mandolin family-ish. Those instruments and bouzoukis, and Irish musicians were using those instruments because they were very, very adaptable for Irish music, for accompanying songs and for playing tunes. So here's these different schools of making in this country starting to emerge. Somebody like Ralph Bown doing absolutely brilliant versions of vintage Martin and Gibson instruments. Stefan Sobel, complete maverick, making first of all lap dulcimers and then mandolas and instruments of that nature, and then in the very early 80s guitars. Meanwhile, Roger Bucknall had started to make guitars and was the first person in this country to go, right, I really want to make these guitars. I really want musicians to play these guitars, and I don't want to make them in 2s and 3s. I want to be able to actually make guitars like a proper grown-up guitar factory owner would make them. And I think that's really interesting, because previous to that, there had been nobody in this country making acoustic guitars in any quantity. There had been these individual people, in some cases making absolutely brilliant instruments, but in very small quantities and almost entirely without the assistance of any machines. So here comes Roger, and Roger is an engineer as well as a man who loves and understands guitars. And so he started to introduce the means to make more guitars. And he was very, very good, and still is very, very good, at contacting musicians and going, I think you should try this. And like all of the best guitar builders that I've ever come across, he also really appreciates it when you give him a challenge. When you don't say, I want one of those, Roger. You say, Roger, I've got this idea. For instance, the very first thing I ever did, make me a dobro and make it better. Make it a proper playable grown-up instrument that looks beautiful and is made of the tone woods that you would use on any great guitar. So that's how I started with Roger. I think it's worth me going into detail and saying that my very first steel strung guitar was a Harmony Sovereign, which were great guitars. All things considered, they were splendid, made in Chicago, I believe, and made of fine timbers. Too big, way too big for me. So I have a few pictures of me as a kid playing that guitar. I traded that guitar in for a Guild, another American company, a good company, and they were the major competitors to the Martin Guitar Company. I traded my Guild F20 in for a rather abused Gibson J45, obviously another American guitar, and eventually traded that guitar for a Martin 00018, which I bought from a shop called Ivor Morant's Music, which was, in a sense, the acoustic guitar shop in the country at that point. And I thought that was it, really. I had a Martin guitar, like Martin Carthy's Martin guitar. And the very first time I was ever asked to play anywhere but in England, I went to Algeria. And on the way back from Algeria, my clothes and my guitar all disappeared. I guess it was Air France or something along those lines. My banjo came home, which is slightly amusing in hindsight, but the clothes and the guitar had gone. So I thought long and hard about what to do. For a while I played an Epiphone Texan, which was a lovely guitar, another American guitar. But meanwhile I'd come across a man called Peter Abnett in Kent, and I'd seen instruments that he'd made, including auto harps and dulcimers and hurdy-gurdies. And I thought anybody who could put that amount of quality and effort on every level into instruments as obscure as that should probably make a really good guitar. And so I commissioned a guitar from him, which would probably have been in 1974, I think. So shortly before I met Roger, I'd had a guitar made by Peter Abnett. I brought this because I thought it would be an amusing little prop. This is the first book on guitars to be published in this country, and it came out in 1977. So I was very, very pleased to appear in this book, especially in the company of Ry Cooder and Leo Kotke on this page, and James Taylor and Jose Feliciano and the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band on the other page. And I'm playing my Abnett guitar in this picture on the tour to support Steel Ice Ban in 1976. So that guitar was the first guitar I ever commissioned. The book is falling to pieces before your very eyes. The second guitar I commissioned was from Roger. I had bought a quite new National Dobro, one of these things, and I was so disappointed in the nature of the Dobro, because basically it was a plywood box with this in it, a resonator, and I thought, I bet it's possible to make a much better guitar that contains a resonator than the National Dobro, bless them, lovely people, are doing with plywood. And a lot of people might argue with me about that, but I took the guitar to Roger and said, take the guts out of this and please make me a guitar. And on that Steel Eye Span tour I played my Abnett and my filed Dobro, which he made me, which I had until I moved to the States in 1988, I think. And at that point I was playing guitars made by Roger, by Stefan Sobel, and by Ralph Bown. And I was very, very, very excited to go to America and to be thrown into that American guitar making scene, because obviously, Britain was late to the idea of making guitars. America had a history going back. I mean, the main guitar company, C.F. Martin, goes back to 1833. Still family owned. So I got to the States and started to meet builders over there, and started to realize that there were just dozens and dozens of really great makers and repairmen. And I became involved through Dick Boak, who used to be the artist relations guy at Martin Guitars. He founded a thing called the Association of Stringed Instrument Artisans, and they adopted me as their pet guitar player, which was like dying and going to heaven, because it meant I would go to these symposia and get to play guitars by the absolutely best makers. And it was wonderful. It was a great experience. I met and played guitars by Jim Olsen and Dana Bourgeois, and then I could go on and on and on and on, actually, but I won't. I also got to know the people at Martin through Dick Boak, and Dick was immensely supportive and wanted me to be involved with Martin Guitars, which it didn't really work out, but Dick did some very funny things during the time that we were working together. If you called the Martin Guitar Company, you would be put on hold and you would be listening to me playing a Sobel guitar, which I thought was immensely entertaining and very ironic. So I started to work with American builders. Jeff Traugott, great builder in California. T.J. Thompson, who is kind of the god of Martin repair. If you can give him a bag of pieces of Martin guitar and he will present you with a beautiful fixed guitar. Dana Bourgeois, he and I worked together on several projects. National Resophonic in California. Santa Cruz Guitars, just all kinds of people. And it was such an education, and it was so exciting to be able to compare those instruments to the instruments that were being made over here. And in many cases, because of, in a sense, arguably the isolation of this country from the long, long, long tradition of making guitars that exists in the USA, I think there were times when I was just very gratified to see that people here were actually ploughing deeper and different furrows to those that were being ploughed in the US. As soon as I moved back from the States, I commissioned Roger to make me this, which is a very much better advance on the Dobro. But meanwhile, both in the States and over here, I'd become obsessed with the whole idea that you could work with an individual human being and have a guitar made which was better than the guitars that the very fine companies manufacturing guitars like Martin and Guild and various other people, they were making great guitars, but they were their guitars. That's what they were. I discovered you could meet somebody and talk to them and give them input, although in hindsight I think you should be very careful what input you give to a guitar maker, because they make the guitars, they know what they're doing, you play them, you hopefully know enough to actually give them a few ideas, but not be daft and dictatorial when you're working with good guitar makers. So I got Roger's guitar and I was happy as a clam. I then, shortly after that, discovered a man called Stefan Sobel. And Stefan Sobel and Roger's histories are intertwined, really. When I lived in the States, I really couldn't afford at any point to invest in the best of American vintage instruments because they're very expensive. When I moved back here and things changed and my career took off, I was able, for instance, to buy a 1931 0018 Martin 12 fret guitar. And that guitar was magnificent. Still is magnificent. It just lives in it lives in Luxembourg now, I think. But I bought that guitar and I showed it to a number of makers, and it inspired builders over here, and it inspired me. It made me realize something which I've always believed in, which is that a 12 fret to the body guitar is actually ideal. And in the States I had worked with Dana Bourgeois on making a 12 fret to the body cutaway slope shouldered guitar, which it didn't exist, it hadn't been made before. This 1931 0018 inspired a lot of instruments to be made. One of which was this, which is, it's called the Orleans. This, I think you will have footage of my friend Richard Hawley playing his all black Orleans, which is a beautiful, beautiful mishmash of guitar styles, which works so beautifully. This guitar here, Roger made for me, and it's the second of these 12 fret guitars. It's called the Orleans because, of course, all Roger's guitars are named after characters from Shakespeare. The Duke of Orleans is a character from Shakespeare, but also I used to live in New Orleans. It should be called the New Orleans model, really. But yeah, I lived in New Orleans, so we were struggling to know what to call it, and we decided we'd call it the Orleans. And it's a wonderful guitar. It's a 12 fret cutaway medium-sized body guitar, and this particular one is made out of the storied Mike Waterson Brazilian rosewood, so it's a very special instrument. I think it's really interesting to consider Roger's position in this unfolding history of British guitar making, because Roger is unique in that he is the person who first set up a shop to make guitars in any quantity and of extremely high quality. And he's maintained that now for almost 50 years. That's some going, actually. And his guitars are played all over the world by professional musicians, and occasionally by dentists and lawyers too, because that's a big market in the guitar world. So I think that it's fair to say Roger should be very proud of himself. The instruments he's making now are better than at any other point in his career, and I'm very proud to be associated with him. The crops are all in, the peaches are rotten, the oranges are piled in their creosote dumps. They're flying us back to the Mexican border to pay all our money to wait back again. Goodbye to my Juan, goodbye Rosalita, adios mis amigos, Jesus y Maria. You won't have your names when you ride the big aeroplane. All they will call you will be Deportee. My father's own father, he waded the river. They took all the money that he made in his life. My brothers and sisters, they worked on the fruit trees. They loaded the trucks till they lay down and died. Goodbye to my Juan, goodbye Rosalita, adios mis amigos, Jesus y Maria. You won't have your names when you ride the big aeroplane. All they will call you will be Deportee. Now some of us are illegal, some are not wanted. The work contract's out and we have to move on. And it's 600 miles to the Mexican border. They chase us like outlaws, like rustlers, like thieves. Goodbye to my Juan, goodbye Rosalita, adios mis amigos, Jesus y Maria. You won't have your names when you ride the big airplane. All they will call you will be Deportee. The sky plane caught fire over Los Gatos Canyon, a fireball of lightning that shook all our hills. Who are all these friends all scattered like dry leaves? The radio says they are just deportees. Goodbye to my Juan, goodbye Rosalita, adios mis amigos, Jesus y Maria. You won't have your names when you ride the big aeroplane. All they will call you will be Deportee. Is this the best way we can grow our big orchards? Is this the best way we can grow our good fruit? To fall like dry leaves and rot on your topsoil and be known by no name except Deportee. Goodbye to my Juan, goodbye Rosalita, adios mis amigos, Jesus y Maria. You won't have your names when you ride the big aeroplane. All they will call you will be Deportee. Goodbye to my Juan, goodbye Rosalita, adios mis amigos, Jesus y Maria. You won't have your names when you ride the big aeroplane. All they will call you will be Deportee. All they will call you will be Deportee. That'll do.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Yeah? Right. So, better break it all down now then.
Yeah.
Got there in the end, anyway. That's what we need.